Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So Father Kevin very graciously invited me to share not only my vocation story, but also to talk a little bit about how to discern in our life, because all the time we're trying to discern God's will, whether we've already made our life's vocational decision or whether we're still in that process of trying to figure out what God's plan is for us. So first, a little bit about my own vocation story. So as a little kid, I grew up in a good Catholic family, oldest of 5 kids. And as a little kid, I used to celebrate Mass using crackers and grape juice. Anybody here ever do that? It's kind of a thing that a lot of you little kids do. And it was great. But then, of course, you hit 11, 12 years old and you realize that girls are pretty. So the idea of priesthood just totally leaves your mind. And when I was a young teen, my life revolved around 3 things: baseball, girls, and music, in that order. Baseball was definitely number 1. And my life's goal was to either be a sports announcer or to be a professional rock musician. Those 2 were what I wanted to do with my life, and that's what I thought was going to lead to happiness. I was passionate about sports and passionate about music, and I wanted to find a way to use that as a career, really just kind of for my own ego, because I did want to be famous and wanted to be out in front of other people. My life changed rather drastically, though, when I was 14 years old and I had the great privilege of going on a pilgrimage to Rome. Now, in 1998, Pope John Paul the Great invited 800,000 of his closest friends to Rome for the Feast of Pentecost, who was celebrating all of the different lay movements in the church. And so I happened to be somewhat tangentially connected with Regnum Christi. And so I got this invitation to go with them for $500 for 10 days without my parents. You can't beat a deal like that. I was just excited to go to a foreign country, not be with my family. It was really quite an experience. But I'll never forget walking into the Colosseum and looking there on that floor and thinking, over 10,000 men, women, and children shed their blood for Jesus Christ right here. Why do I not care more about that? If they're willing to die for Christ, why am I willing to live just for my own ego and for my own pleasure and for my own, just be rich and famous? It didn't make any sense to me, and the witness of the martyrs really struck me that if people are willing to die for Christ, this must be true. It can't be false. If someone's willing to shed their blood, no one would do that for a lie or for a myth. And then as part of that pilgrimage, we walked into the Sistine Chapel, of course, for a tour, and the ceiling's great, but for me, what struck me was the Last Judgment of Michelangelo on the wall. That was incredibly powerful, to see this 60-foot tall painting of what is going to happen. It's a guarantee. We know from faith that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. And in looking at that, for the first time, it struck me that there's really only 2 options at the end of life. It's heaven or it's hell. Which one was I headed towards? Which one did I want to head towards? And I realized it struck me to the heart that I'm not really striving for heaven. I'm striving for the things of this earth, and how empty that was at the end of time. So when I came back from Rome, I was like, you know what? I've got to change my life. I've got to start a prayer life. I've got to start repenting of my sins and start seeking the Lord. And that lasted for a week or 2. And then, it was kind of back to life as normal. However, the next summer, my dad and mom kind of sprung on us, and they said, we're going to go on this great vacation to this weird, crazy place called Catholic Family Land. And I said, Catholic Disneyland? Really? Where is this place? Never heard of it before. But some people from my parish had gone there, and they came back raving about it, so my family jumped in the van and took our trailer all the way across from Maryland to Ohio, where we spent a life-changing week when I was about 15 years old here at Catholic Family Land. And there were about 3 things I was reflecting on that really changed my life very powerfully right here at the Holy Family Fest. First of all, I met other teens, other peers who had a passionate love for Jesus Christ. And that was the first time I'd ever seen that. And it blew my mind that you could be a totally normal person, love sports, love hanging out, and love Jesus. Back in the day, we didn't call it Marads, we called it Marie Allen Doms, and it was actually a tent up at Holy Family Field, which was, some of you may remember back then. But just the fact that I could be standing there with 150 other teenagers just praising the Lord really made a huge impact on me. Another thing that made a huge impact on me was Father Kevin's jokes, homilies. They were very powerful. And yes, Father Kevin was still there 25 years ago when I first started coming to Catholic Family Land. But he preached holiness. He said that holiness was the goal of life. And actually at my parish, I'd never even heard the word holiness from the pulpit. I never thought that holiness maybe for the saints, maybe for those plaster statues, but certainly not for me, certainly not for an average teenager. I didn't think that holiness was real. But he says that everyone is called to holiness, and that holiness is the only thing that's going to save the world. In fact, I love that quote from Archbishop Charles Chaput. He said, the only people that truly change the world are saints, and each one of us is called to be a saint. And hearing that preached for the first time made me realize that my life has now got to be about something bigger than myself. It's got to be about the Lord Jesus. And then, of course, through Marie Ellen Doms, we spent time in Eucharistic adoration, and that was the first time I had ever done that. And having that profound encounter with Jesus Christ, truly present in the Eucharist, made me realize he is real. He loves me personally, passionately. And what can I do any less than give my heart and my soul completely and totally to him? And so that probably is really what started to spark this desire to say, you know what? If Jesus is real, and holiness is real and possible, and the calling of every human life, how can I live for anything less than to give it all for Jesus Christ who gave it all for me? That fall, after coming back from Catholic Family Land, my parish started perpetual adoration, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And my family signed up for an hour. And my parents were great about it because they never forced us to go. They just simply invite. And at first I was kind of like, you know what? I'd rather watch TV. There's stuff I'd rather do on Sunday nights rather than go to adoration. But then I thought a little while later, I said, you know, if this is truly Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity that I really say that I believe, I would be an absolute fool to rather choose TV over spending an hour with him. And so I started to go to adoration. And many of you can testify the incredible power of Eucharistic adoration, the power of just being in silence, the power of just allowing him to radiate to us. You know, and I love that great story from the life of St. John Vianney, who was, of course, the patron saint of parish priests. And every day he would go into the church and he'd see this poor farmer spending a few minutes there in front of the Blessed Sacrament, half an hour, and then leaving. And every day this poor farmer, this poor peasant would go in, spend time, and leave. And after months and months of watching this devout man come and pray, John Vianney pulled him aside and said, "What do you do when you go in to pray? What do you say?" And he just said, "I look at him and he looks at me." And St. John Vianney said that was the best definition of prayer he had ever heard. I look at him and he looks at me. And that is a great way to spend Eucharistic adoration, looking at him and allowing him, his powerful, penetrating gaze, to direct himself immediately right into our hearts. It's like as we spend time outdoors in the sun, we gain a suntan. And as we come in front of the Son of God, we become more like him. He changes us into him. And I discovered a powerful, personal, passionate love for Jesus Christ and his love for me in the Holy Eucharist. Later on that year, I was very blessed to be homeschooled. Do we have any homeschool families here? That's great to see. That is really a real blessing. I loved being homeschooled. And one of the great blessings of being homeschooled was when I was a senior in high school, I got to take classes at a local community college. And for the first time, I got to meet people who had very radically different worldviews than I did. And in getting to know these people, and they were just talking about the next party, and the next drinking bout, and the next time with the girlfriend, and the next paycheck. And all of their life was based upon the things of this earth. And they were miserable. They weren't happy. And I could see that they were constantly striving and striving and striving for happiness, and they couldn't find it in the things of this world. And it made me reflect, who were the happiest people I knew? They were the people who lived for Jesus Christ. They were the saints. And not only the saints who had died, but the many saints that I knew who were living, who were walking around. My grandparents and the holy men and women from my parish that I looked on as real heroes in the faith. And I said, if I want to be happy, I can't choose the things of this world. I must choose the things of God. And so that's really what drew me to the priesthood, is to live and to lay down my life for something greater than myself, for Jesus Christ. And what an incredible gift it is. I've been ordained for 9 years, and I absolutely love being a priest. What an amazing joy it is. And I know many young people here are trying to discern whether God is calling them to the priesthood or religious life. And if you've never been asked, consider this your ask. Consider the statement of saying, you should consider it. Because I think it's the duty of every young man or woman to ask themselves, am I called? Am I called to give it all for Jesus Christ? Because he gave it all for us. So now we ask the question, okay, but how do I discern? How do I discern God's will for my life? And this is not just for young people, because even as husbands and wives, as fathers and mothers, we're still discerning. So when you're young, we should be discerning things like what college to attend. We should be discerning what major to have. If we're called to marriage, what spouse do I choose? If we're older, like even as a priest, just this past Sunday, I got installed as pastor of a parish. I'm thrilled to be pastor of this wonderful parish. Yeah, it was a great blessing. And every day I'm discerning. I'm saying, Lord, how do you want me to lead these people? How do you want me to deal with this difficult situation, this conflict in the parish? How do you want me to bring these souls closer to heaven? And as parents, as husbands and wives, we're discerning what job to take, where to live, where to take our family on vacation. Well, that one's kind of a gimme here at this point, Catholic family land, right? But there's things that we should be discerning even as we are continuing throughout our life. So how do we discern God's will? I have 4 rules for discernment, 4 things that can be helpful as different guideposts of how to discern. First of all, look at our converted desires, because God will often put the desires on our heart for what his will is. Now, I say converted desires, because if we have a desire to become rich and famous for our own ego or for a pleasant, easy life, that's not a converted desire. That's not a desire that could potentially lead to happiness and to holiness. So we need to look at what desire do we have that could lead to holiness. So whether it's the desire for the priesthood or desire for religious life, what is the desire God has placed upon your heart? And I think that's a really important piece, is that God works through our desires. A lot of times young men will come to me. I'm a chaplain of a Catholic high school, and I've been chaplain for the last 7 years. And young men will come to me having profound encounters with Jesus, and they say to me kind of moping, they're like, Father, I guess now I have to be a priest. And I said, do you want to be a priest? Do you desire to do the things priests do? No. Okay, then you're not called to be a priest. There you go. All right, pretty simple, right? Because God will put the desires on our hearts for the things he wants us to do. Now, there certainly are many people who have been totally opposed to religious vocation, and then later on down the line, God has put that desire in their heart. So continue to be open to the desires and don't close it off saying, well, that's it. My desires are done. I don't have to worry about that anymore. We have to constantly discern, okay, is this desire going to lead me deeper to holiness? Now, one of the big objections that people have to having a religious vocation is the question of, well, I also desire family life. Well, guess what? That just means you're normal. That's a good thing. I desire family life. When I look out and see these 800 people at a family fest, these beautiful families, I am filled with a longing and saying, that is a beautiful vocation, and I love that vocation. So every normal human being has a natural desire for marriage. That's how God made us. That's the natural kind of end to which we were created, because that is a way in which we profoundly imitate God through marriage. But some people, on top of that natural desire for marriage, have a supernatural desire to give it up for the sake of Christ. It's not natural, it's supernatural to want to give up that natural good of marriage. And yet God has put that desire upon some people's hearts. So even if you say, I love marriage, I want to be married, that doesn't mean you're not called to the priesthood or religious life. It could mean that you're just normal. Some of you are normal, maybe maybe not all of us. But it could mean we're just normal, but some people would have that supernatural desire then to give it up. So we pay attention to what are the desires God has placed on our heart. That's the first step that we look at. A second thing we look at is, what are our gifts and talents? When I was chaplain of a former high school, I had this sophomore come into my office one day, and we just sit down, we were just chatting about inconsequential things, and I said, so Jeremy, what do you want to do in life? What do you think is your calling? And he said, I want to be a Major League Baseball player. I said, that's great, but you didn't make the JV team as a sophomore, so I'm not sure that's your calling. He's like, no, that's definitely my calling. Like, well, if you don't have the talent, then perhaps God is not calling you to that. If someone feels called to be a professional singer, but they can't carry a tune in the bucket, it's probably not our calling. So we have to discern, okay, what are objectively our gifts and talents? What are our abilities? How can we live out perhaps the desires that we have on our heart? It's a great story from the life of St. Thomas More, who I love, such a great saint. And he was very devout from the time he was very young. And when he was quite young, he thought that he was called to the religious life. In fact, he wanted to be, I believe, as a Carthusian monk. And so he went off for several months to try out the life of a Carthusian monk. And several months later, he came back to his family. And his family said, well, what happened? We thought that was it. You were gone for good. You were going to join this religious community. And And he said a great quote. He said, "It's better to be a chaste layman than an unchaste priest." It's better to be a chaste layman than an unchaste priest. In other words, he recognized that he was not given the gift of celibacy, and recognizing that objectively allowed him to find what his true vocation was, which of course was marriage, to be chancellor, and then ultimately to become a saint, to lay down his life for Christ and for the Catholic Church. So look at objectively, what are our gifts and talents? How could God use that? A third thing we should look at and pay attention to is, what do other people say? For example, there was this one man who was talking to me one time. He was about 25 years old, and he was saying, "Father, I am so convinced that I am supposed to marry Sarah." And that's beautiful. I said, that's so great. You're called to marry Sarah. Well, how long have you guys been dating? Oh, well, we're not dating. Okay, well, I mean, do you think you're going to be dating in the future? He said, well, I asked her to go out with me, and she said no. But I know this is God's will. I said, I hate to break it to you, bro, but it's probably not, right? Because that's one way in which we know God's will, is what doors is he opening and what doors is he closing. So pay attention. If people have said to you maybe, hey, have you ever thought about being a priest? Have you ever thought about being a sister? Maybe that's a way in which you know that is God's will. Sometimes he works through the voices of other people calling you to this or that. Or even as a husband or wife, and you say, maybe I feel called to work at this particular job, but if you keep applying and keep getting turned down, then that's not God's will for our life. So pay attention to what doors and windows God is opening in our life, and that's what we walk through to find his will. Finally, the last thing that we have to look at is, where do we find peace? Where do we find peace? When I was in high school and trying to discern what college to attend, there were two colleges. One was Franciscan University of Steubenville, and the other one was Mount St. Mary's College in Emmitsburg, Maryland, which was about half an hour from where I was from. And I really wanted to go to Mount St. Mary's. They had a great baseball team. I could play baseball. They were giving me lots of scholarship money. It was great. But I brought it to adoration and just felt a lack of peace. I felt unsettled. However, when I started thinking about Franciscan University, I found this profound peace settled on my soul. And that's how I knew, all right, this is God's will for me. So I went to Steubenville and had 4 of the best years of my life. It was incredible. So that's how we know, one way in which we know God's will for our life. Do we have peace when we think about being a priest, being a married man? When we think about this job or this living in this location, do we have peace thinking about this future choice that we could make? God often works through the peace that settles upon our heart. So these, I think, are the ways in which we can know God's will. And we look at all 4 of them. We look at our natural gifts and talents. We look at kind of the impact of other people and what they say about us and the doors that God is opening. We look at the desires that God has placed upon our heart. And we look upon the peace that God gives us when we think about a certain course of action. But here's what's important to remember. First of all, God wants us to know his will even more than we want to know it. Sometimes we think God's will is some mysterious thing that if I pray the right prayer, I'll find God's will. If I do the right devotion, then I'll know. God wants to reveal it to us. And sometimes he kind of puts it off because he knows the only way we will seek him is by kind of making that a little mysterious. And sometimes he doesn't show us the entire path. He'll just show us the next step. Yet nevertheless, God really does want us to know his will because he wants us to do his will. And finally, we can never forget that God's will is our happiness. Whatever God is calling you to is where you will find the deepest joy. Not necessarily an easy life, not necessarily a life without suffering, because there's suffering in every vocation. There's suffering in every way of life. Yet it's going to be the holiest and happiest you will ever be if you follow God's will for your life. And as long as you seek God's will with an upright heart and really truly seek, whatever you choose, he will make good. He brings good out of all things. So maybe you're saying, well, I made a mistake in choosing this path instead of this path. God can write straight with crooked lines, as the saying goes. So trust that his will is your happiness. And don't be afraid to say yes, to open your heart to him. Because as the great poet Dante once wrote, in his will is our peace.